All right. Awesome. I think we are live now. Perfect. So welcome everyone. Thank you for tuning in to our first event, the month of July, to kick off our 10-year anniversary celebration for the Ohm of Medicine. We have Senator Jeff Irwin joining us tonight to discuss engaging politically around the cannabis issue and just engaging politically in general. But first I want to touch on a couple things. So for those who might not know, Ohm of Medicine is in its 10th year of operations. We're celebrating that anniversary all month long for the month of July. We're so thankful to have been serving this community for 10 years, and we're super excited for the next 10 years. And tonight, to kick off our celebrations, we have, like I said, Senator Jeff Irwin here to discuss a political action plan that we can all have to engage around this issue. And Jeff is someone that we've been working with for years to further the cannabis movement and drug policy reform as a whole. He's been a champion for the cannabis issue in Lansing long before it was a popular topic, and he has been just an outright trailblazer on this issue. So he's someone that we always go to when we're looking for advice on how to engage politically. So I'm super excited for the conversation that we're going to have tonight. But before we start that off, I want to share a message from the Michigan Cannabis Industry Association. They sent us a little congratulatory message for our 10 year. So we're going to kick off the celebrations with this video, and then we'll dive into the discussion. Awesome. All right. So thank you so much again for tuning in. If you're just joining us, we are here with Senator Jeff Irwin to discuss how to engage politically around cannabis and just engage politically in general. And like I said, we've been working with Jeff for many years around this topic. And yeah, to kick it off, I'll just throw it over to Jeff, and please just give us some background on your political career and the work that you've done around cannabis.
Sure. Thanks, Lisa, for having me, and happy 10-year anniversary to Ohm of Medicine and all the Ohmies who might be watching. 10 years is a long time in this industry, and I remember when I first got elected, Ohm of Medicine and many of the folks who were connected with Ohm were some of the first folks who reached out to me as an elected official to say, hey, we're here, we're in Ann Arbor. We want to have a positive presence in the community. We want to work with you and everyone else to make sure that that's the case. And so that was just such a positive, way to build that relationship. And it's just been great to be able to work with the folks at Ohm with respect to everything that's happened, all the changes over the course of the last 10 years in the industry. And I think it bears repeating, or it bears sort of stressing to say that 10 years is a particularly long time in this industry. And when the Ohm of Medicine opened up, it was a totally different sort of time in terms of the public attitudes around cannabis and medical marijuana. And the folks at Ohm really took a huge risk by opening. Everyone who opened at that time in the very early days was really sticking their neck out to provide safe and legal access to people who were in need of medical cannabis. And the state wasn't stepping up to create laws so that people could have a reasonable, safe and legal access point, a reasonable commercial relationship around this. And during the many years while the legislature in fits and starts tried to create some sort of legal framework for the commercial operations, it was folks like Ohm of Medicine who were sticking their necks out and providing that access point. But Ohm went even further, I think, than almost everybody else in the state. Ohm was really out front in a way that wasn't just out there providing access to their patients, but also was really out front on advocacy and was willing to come to Lansing, testify in committees, was willing to reach out to their state lawmakers and reach out to their city council people and reach out to the mayors and the police chiefs and, build those relationships and let folks know that what you were doing wasn't just not scary, but was the right thing. And I can't tell you how many of my colleagues in the legislature accepted an invitation from Ohm of Medicine to come and tour the facility. I know it was many. I know pretty much every lawmaker from our area at every level has toured Ohm, has talked to the medical professionals at Ohm, has talked to patients. And that made a huge difference because really in a lot of those early days, a lot of my colleagues in the legislature were just afraid of the unknown. They didn't know what it would look like. They didn't know how it would operate. They had all these visions in their head of what it might look like. And when those lawmakers were able to actually go to Ohm, which was a bright, friendly, awesome space and still is, I think it really made a big difference in terms of changing those minds. And it all had to do with building relationships, which is what I'm going to encourage people to do throughout this, is to make sure that your lawmakers know who you are and what it is you want. So that's a little bit of the history of I guess my relationship with Ohm. To give you my really sort of brief political CV, I got involved when I first came to Ann Arbor to attend the University of Michigan. I got involved in action around homelessness and around affordable housing and around environmental issues. And a seat opened up on the Washtenaw County Board of Commissioners. So I ran for that office when I was an undergrad and won. And so that was in 1999. I had an opportunity to serve for 11 years on the County Board of Commissioners, and then I ran for state rep. I served in that position for 6 years. And then I just recently got elected to the state Senate. And during the 2 years between when I was term limited out of being a state rep and when I was running for state Senate, I got very involved in the coalition to regulate marijuana like alcohol and involved in the campaign to try to make sure that we had it on the ballot in 2018 so that we could score that big victory for the people of Michigan, so that we could end cannabis prohibition, so that we could create a reasonable way for people to trade in a product that has been a big part of a lot of people's lives for the whole 80 years that we've had prohibition in this country. And that was a huge step that we all took together to really provide liberty and opportunity to a whole lot of folks. And I don't think it would have been possible if it wouldn't have been for those folks like the folks who were at the very outset of Ohm's opening and the folks who've continued to be involved with Ohm. It wouldn't have happened without those folks doing what they did in 2010 to stick their necks out, to provide safe and legal access, to start to normalize cannabis trade in our communities, and to show everyone that a dispensary is not a scary thing. To help establish the statistics that we now have in multiple studies that show that cannabis businesses reduce crime in a downtown area or in a neighborhood. And so we couldn't have shown all those things if it weren't for folks like the folks at Ohm. So that's my tediously long introduction.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah. And I think, one thing that really stuck out there is you were talking about the willingness to engage with elected officials and to come to Lansing. What would you say to someone who is nervous about engaging in that way? I hear from a lot of patients that they don't have the statistics, they might not have all the facts, so they fear engaging. But from your perspective as an elected official, what do you feel when someone comes to you sharing their concerns on an issue, and what do you want to hear from people?
Yeah, I guess a couple of things I would say to attempt to encourage people to be willing to reach out and build that relationship. One is that legislators are people just like everyone else, and this is a bit of a window to answer more directly your question, which is that what works to approach one legislator is going to be very different than what works to approach another legislator. What kind of pushes their buttons, what they're interested in, what gets them fired up is going to be different. right? And so, yeah, I just think you should walk into it recognizing that they're people just like anyone else. The other thing I think that is important for folks to keep in mind is that, we're your employees. I work for the roughly 280,000 people in my constituency. And when someone comes to me with a question or a concern, um, my first response is to say, okay, here is, one of my supervisors, one of my direct reports who, has a concern, and I need to listen to it, and have an open mind, take it on board, and then give this person a meaningful response. Whether maybe this is a new idea, something I've never considered before, and I need to kind of take in their information and continue to learn about that item, or whether it's something that I've already considered thoroughly. I need to let that person know either what I'm doing or not going to do on that issue. So folks should know that from my perspective, when folks reach out to me, I appreciate it. I tell people all the time, please continue reaching out to me. You're helping me do my job. You're helping me understand what's important to you. And we're not going to agree on every single issue every single time. But we can have a continuing and respectful conversation about all these issues. And it's very welcome. If you've got an elected official who is not welcome to that sort of back and forth, then you should probably try to change their face rather than trying to change their mind. But I think what you're going to find is that most elected officials are interested in hearing from their constituents. They're interested in having these discussions about these issues. That's why they got involved in the first place. And so everybody has their passions. Everybody has their areas where they're more interested and less interested. And I would just suggest that if your issue is cannabis law reform, and you've got an elected official who maybe that's not an issue for them, it's not something that they want to work on, it's not something that they're passionate about, take the same advice that the Home of Medicine gives to new edibles patients. Start slow, go slow. Maybe go to one of their events. Watch them speak, maybe see what they're talking about on their social media channel. Try to get to know them a tiny bit, maybe before you approach them. Or maybe go to one of their coffee hours and ask a question in a public setting where I think they're going to be very interested in responding to you in a thorough and polite way. Just kind of dip your toe in. Send an email. It really is that easy. You just start to build the relationship slowly, and over time, if you keep asking these questions, I think you're going to see that folks are going to give you better and better answers. Particularly the folks who aren't already interested in this issue are going to give you better and better answers as you give them time to sort of learn and develop in their understanding of cannabis in general. I mean, I think one of the things that folks need to recognize about our elected officials is they tend to be older. Voters tend to skew older as well. And cannabis is very much a generational issue when you look at public support for, say, cannabis law reform and for legalization. Young people are very supportive of it, almost regardless of party. And for older folks, that's not as much the case. And I think that that's partly because a lot of these folks grew up in an environment where they may not have had much or any actual real life experience with cannabis, them personally or with their friends or with maybe their cohort. And also, they've been fed this steady diet of often misinformation by the Office of National Drug Control Policy and by others who have made it their business to support and continue prohibition. And for instance, I remember when I was young, it was right in the heart of the Nancy Reagan "just say no on drugs" era. And nobody, I think, who is my age, who's kind of like a Gen Xer, can fry an egg without thinking about that commercial that was on over and over and over and over again, right? And so, give these elected officials the space to, gain the information and to, come to the right conclusions, even if maybe there's someone who has been steeped in misinformation.
Yeah, thank you. And I really appreciate how you listed a few of the options for people for engagement, because there's so many ways that we can start to build those relationships, like you said, that sometimes it can even be overwhelming. But even just an email or showing up at a coffee hours, like you said, is such a great way to start. And I would just love to hear from your perspective, like when someone sends an email to your office or calls and leaves a message with a staff member, what is the route of that message getting to you? Because I hear from a lot of people sometimes that they don't ever think that their messages reach the elected official. And I know it's probably different for every office, but it's just I think helpful for people to hear maybe how the back end works on that so that they'll feel more comfortable reaching out.
Yeah, I mean, you're right that every office looks at it differently. I've heard that some offices will, like tally responses and talk about them at staff meetings and use that information to make decisions about where the office is going to stand on an issue or another issue. That doesn't really track with sort of my philosophy or the way I run my office. But so the way we approach it is more from a standpoint of sort of service and responsiveness. We want to make sure that every email that comes in gets a response within a reasonable amount of time. And we want that response to be meaningful. And so usually what happens is there's an initial conversation between myself and whoever's handling the email about what the answer is going to be in general. And then that answer is kind of drafted up, and then I take a look at every piece that goes out and make sure that it really reflects an answer that is both accurate and responsive, and really gets at what the person's asking. We try to really respond to people, because one of the things I notice a lot of offices do, well, they will just say, hey, look, we've registered your concern and we'll keep your thoughts in mind. I really try to let people know what I'm thinking, because if they don't agree with me, I want to give them an opportunity to say, hey, Irwin, you're wrong, and here's why. And once again, then I can take that information in, kind of put it in the tumbler and think, okay, maybe I am wrong, or maybe I'm not. And so then we just kind of do that and rinse and repeat, and many dozens of times a week. We get hundreds of emails a week into the office. Now, many of them are duplicates, but certainly there are. This conversation is constantly happening between me and my staff on a daily basis about, all right, what's come in and what do we need to answer and what are people concerned about today? And so we're constantly talking about constituent concerns. In fact, every single staff meeting, the first part of the meeting is, what do we have to do in terms of constituents? What are people asking about? And then also the other piece that we get from people all the time, and I want to encourage people to take advantage of this as well, is we get just like requests for help from constituents. So, if you know friends or if you yourself are struggling with some sort of state bureaucracy, call your state lawmaker. We don't have a magic wand. We can't always fix it. We can't literally say, for instance, go into the unemployment agency and turn on your unemployment. But if you engage us, we will continue to knock on their door on your behalf and continue to bother them until they fix the problem. And so, that's a big part of what we do, just answering people's questions and then trying to follow up on their concerns to make sure that, say someone who has a problem with their food stamps, or someone has a problem with a loved one in the prisons, or, all sorts of different concerns like this that relate to state government. I encourage people to contact their lawmakers. That's what we're here for. And we should at least be able to give you a responsive, quality answer, even if we can't, literally fix the problem, whatever it is.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And yeah, I really also appreciate that, because, I know that in these current times, it can seem a little discouraging looking at our political landscape, but just reminding people, like you said, that they are people and that they work for the constituents, and to just start to build those relationships and use them as a resource is such a beautiful way to put it. And so before we kind of move forward to the next topic, I think if you could just map out some of the things you already spoke about, but how to engage with the legislator, like from email all the way up to meeting in person. And then if someone is really concerned about a specific bill, what are the steps that they can engage around that specific topic?
Yeah. So first step I would say that anybody should take is, look your lawmaker up on the internet and find their email address, which is really easy to find on michiganlegislature.org, and send them an email requesting to get on their email list. Every single lawmaker, or almost every single lawmaker, is going to have an email list that they maintain and send out regular updates. I send out usually 2 a month. And so, get on that list. Then you'll be getting a steady stream of information from your lawmaker. You can see what they're talking about. You can see what sort of bills they're introducing. And that might be helpful for you. And you just get on their radar screen too. And then do the same thing on social media. Look them up on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram. Maybe they've got a TikTok page. I don't know. I've been thinking about setting one of those up lately. Connect with them on there and see what they're doing. And, and also once you connect with them on there, not only can you see what they're doing, but you can also engage them there. And so that's one of the great things about social media is that, yeah, you can send your lawmaker an email, and I encourage you to do that. That's kind of the easiest thing. Ask them a question, urge them to support a bill or oppose a bill, and you should have a back and forth. But the great thing about social media is that when you ask that question there, that answer and that question are both happening in front of a community of people. And that lawmaker is being sort of called to make a statement in a public way. And I think that's important too. I think you need to be respectful and I'm not sure if careful is the right word. Maybe respectful is the right word in the way that you do that. But I think on behalf of your issues and your concerns. But I do think that it's a great way to engage a lawmaker. And I'm constantly communicating with people on Twitter and Facebook and stuff. Then I would say that if you want to sort of take it to the next level, that's when you can start to develop like a more of a real life relationship with your lawmakers or your city council people. It's campaign season right now too. There's a primary about a month from now, and a lot of your city council people or county prosecutors or county sheriffs or officials like that are running for election right now. Many of them may be running for an election that is decided in the primary. I know right here in Washtenaw County, most of the elections, certainly the countywide elections, are decided in the primary. So, reach out to these folks now when they're running. Ask them what they're going to do on these issues. That's the perfect time to reach out to an elected official, is when they're running. It's a perfect time to ask them questions. Well, what will you do on this issue or that issue should you be elected? And so it's not just on the campaign trail, but also many of us have public events, whether it's town halls or coffee hours. And you'll hear about those if you're on the email list or if you connect with them on social media. Sometimes you'll hear about them in the news media, but it's kind of hard these days to keep track of all that, to stay connected to all that. And so, show up at their events, ask the question publicly. So those are a number of different ways. Now, if you're interested in a particular bill or a particular proposal, my suggestion is to do, probably starting out via email. If your concerns are very detailed, I wouldn't hesitate to ask for a short meeting with your lawmaker. In my office, we set up meetings with constituents all the time. I had a couple meetings today with individual constituents who wanted to talk to me about some police accountability issues. And so, once again, I'm happy to make time for my constituents. They're my bosses, and if you've got something that really does require a conversation, well, then ask for one. Beyond that, I would say send in your suggestions for bills or your questions about supporting or opposing bills via email. That's just the easiest way to do it. It's easier to track. It's easier to get a straight answer that's then in writing. So I strongly encourage that. And if you're suggesting that they make a change to a bill, just be very, very specific about what it is exactly you want. Do your best to try to really have a complete idea, in the sense that so, and I don't want to encourage folks to not do something because you don't have your ideas couched in technical jargon, but say for instance we're debating these bills on expungement right now, and the bills do a great job of dealing with use and possession, but they don't do a good job of dealing with folks who were arrested for manufacture, for instance. That would be a very specific point you could make, that it doesn't really require you to know, the legal code for manufacture or anything like that. But it does help to make your point as sort of specific to the law as possible, because you want to get a good answer that is really responsive to your specific concern. You don't want them to sort of give you one of these weaselly answers. And two, you just want to communicate clearly. And in every legislative office, there are a lot of moving parts. I mean, just with respect to these clean slate expungement bills I'm talking about, there are dozens and dozens of moving parts and important sort of policy considerations. So really trying to zero in on the one that you're getting at is important.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for that. And just kind of moving along with that same topic, I'd love to hear an update from you on the expungement bills in the package that's moving through, kind of where we're at, what it includes, what it doesn't include, how people can continue to engage if there's steps that they need to take to still support the passage of these bills.
Yeah, absolutely. So right now, I would say this clean slate or expungement package is the most exciting thing happening in Lansing that's positive. Obviously, we're all dealing with the fallout from the corona apocalypse, and there's a lot happening there. But this is an area where there's really been good bipartisan work for positive criminal justice reform, and I feel like we're right on the doorstep of getting something really important done. So here's what's happened. A number of bills were introduced in the House, and they were introduced under the moniker Clean Slate. And what these bills do is these bills basically say that let me take one quick step back. And currently in Michigan, the expungement policy is pretty limited. You can only request to have your record clean if you have up to 1 felony or up to 2 misdemeanors. And so that's very, very restrictive. And a lot of folks, particularly anybody who has a drug-related crime, is not eligible for expungement because usually you have multiples. Say, for instance, if you were selling, you may also have been maintaining a drug home, or you may have been engaged in a criminal conspiracy. So there's a lot of stacking of charges that happens in these cases. So anyway, what these bills are doing is they're trying to expand that. They're trying to expand the numbers in terms of eligibility, and they're trying to improve the process in a number of ways. So the bills are House Bill 4980 through House Bills 4985 plus House Bill 5120. And so there are 6 bills in the package, and what they do broadly is they say that if you have gone a number of years without reoffending and you have a low-level offense, then you're going to have your record cleared automatically without having to apply. And that's really, really important because the studies show that only 6.5% of the people who are eligible to have their records clear ever do so. And that's because of the cost and the uncertainty and the difficulty navigating these systems. So what we're basically saying in these clean slate bills is that if you've gone 7 years since your misdemeanor or 10 years since your felony, you haven't reoffended, and your felony isn't on the list of serious felonies, then it's going to be automatically waived. That's huge. It's going to affect hundreds of thousands of people. Now, one of the biggest areas that this affects is cannabis. We have about 235,000 people who currently have a record for use or possession. And what these bills are going to do is these bills are going to say, if you've gone a number of years, then it's going to be automatic. It's going to be taken off your record. Even if you haven't gone the 7 or 10 years, though, there's a bill relative specifically to cannabis, House Bill 4982, that says that if you've got one of those low-level cannabis offenses, you can apply with no matter how many you have, and it sets up a system, without getting too deep into the weeds, where basically the prosecutors have to oppose your expungement to get it. And so that's going to help those 235,000 people. The folks who are left out, though, are the folks who have a conviction for manufacture or for possession with intent to deliver, and so that's the part that still is unresolved in my view. There's one more bill in the package that we call One Bad Night. And what this bill does is this bill basically says if you have a whole number of felonies or misdemeanors that all arise out of one incident, then they're to be counted as one. So you put all these bills together and it's the clean slate package. These bills started in the House and they passed the House with big majorities. They've now been in the Senate. We had a number of Senate hearings on these bills. The cannabis industry was well represented, supporting the bills, asking for some improvements, but largely supporting them. And we passed them with a big majority out of the Senate Judiciary Committee just a couple weeks ago. I'm hoping that those bills will be up for a final vote here at the end of July. But if not, I'm pretty confident we'll see them, before the fall. These bills have to get passed. They're going to help hundreds of thousands of people, not only in this space, but also there are literally hundreds of thousands of people who have misdemeanors for driving with license suspended and driving without insurance. We need to get those off people's records so that they can apply for jobs and get student loans and those types of things. And plus, we know that a lot of those offenses are really related to the outrageously high car insurance rates in the city of Detroit. In addition to that, just to finally explain the bills, there's one piece that I really thought was left out, and that was juvenile records. These bills all deal with adult convictions. The whole juvenile system of adjudications is a completely different system, different laws. And so I introduced in the Senate Bill 891, its companion 892, along with Senator Lucido, that will provide greater confidentiality of juvenile records and also provide for greater expungement for juveniles, sort of a juvenile clean slate, which I think is important. We certainly don't want to set up a system where we pass these bills and then it becomes advantageous to be try it as an adult, or to commit your crime when you're 18 rather than when you're 16. That doesn't make any sense to me. I don't think it makes a lot of sense to anybody. So that's where those bills are at. They're in front of the full Senate right now. If you want to help support these bills, write your senator and urge them to vote yes. If you want to support these bills, but also encourage them to be improved, write your senator and say, these bills are important and you should pass them. But what you should also do is you should finish the job on cannabis. Because what a lot of my colleagues are saying right now is that, look, now that cannabis is legal, we should take everyone who committed the crime before that is now legal activity, and we should wipe that away. Well, if that's the philosophy, these bills don't go far enough. Because right now it is legal to manufacture. Anyone can grow 12 plants per household. And so why aren't we giving those folks an open door to get their records cleared? And right now, I would point out that there are plenty of people who are distributing cannabis and doing so legally and making money off of it. And so why not give the folks who were doing that at a time when it was not legal an opportunity to get in front of a judge and to show that, they ought to have their record cleared so that they can, be a bigger contributor to the community and to themselves and to their own families. So those are the improvements that we're trying to get to the legislation. And, I also think that one of the things my fellow lawmakers need to hear is that possession with intent to deliver doesn't necessarily mean that that person was, some sort of drug kingpin, Pablo Escobar type. It doesn't even mean that they were selling any drugs or selling any cannabis. It really could have just meant that they were, someone who was kind of like a Costco shopper and, bought more than the police thought was, the amount that an individual should have. And as a result, they got charged with and maybe convicted with possession with intent to deliver. And, there's also a big problem with the drug war and the way that confidential informants are used. And what I try to tell all my colleagues is that there's a lot of young people who got possession with intent to deliver charges and convictions because they were the ones that were not willing to roll on their friends. And, is that the activity that we want to punish forever? Is that the activity? Is that the kind of person that we think is a threat to society? I don't think so.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much for that recap. That was beautiful. And so to just sum it up, where we're at is that hoping to get them to pass through the Senate at the end of this month, if not early fall. And so, like you said, just expressing support right away. Would you say, though, in terms of strategy, is it better for people to just be calling in now or to wait until we know that it's like up for a floor vote, or just both?
I would say call now. Call as soon as you can. Call as often as you can. Send the emails. I think that's what's most likely to get folks to either be willing to make an alteration to the bills to improve them, or to make a positive commitment on behalf of the bills. There's no real reason to wait at this time, especially because this is something that I think is on the radar screen of most lawmakers. It's been a big issue. It's been coming for a while, and it's really one of the areas where there's a lot of bipartisan work being done, and that's good to see. I think all of us like that on some level.
Awesome. Yeah. So we will be sending out information for people to express support around these bills as well. And so, yeah, urging lawmakers to pass the clean slate package and to add those additions for those who have charges around manufacturing and intent to distribute. Because, yeah, we're doing the same thing here, right? So
now, I would add, since I'm so long-winded, I want to add that I also introduced Senate Bill 416, which was sort of like my version of cannabis expungement, which not only would provide that opportunity for folks with, possession with intent to deliver and manufacture to get their records cleared, but also proposed to put some language in the law that was there to protect medical marijuana caregivers and providers who were busted during the time period when it was kind of a gray market and no one really knew what the laws were. There were some communities where prosecutors and police went really hard after providers. And I think that if the judges were to look at these individuals and who they were and why they were doing what they were doing and their path to become providers, they might see that these individuals should have their records cleared and are not, their crime was not indicative of any sort of victimization or threat to anyone else. I mean, really, these were literally caregivers who are sticking their neck out to help people, oftentimes sticking their neck out to help cancer patients and folks like that, and we're just really gone hard on by prosecutors in certain counties. And it's, to me, it's just disgusting that we have a state where the law is applied so differently in different areas. That really shouldn't be the case. It's almost as gross as how in some communities you have to wait 4 hours to vote, and in other communities you can walk right in, which is why I would encourage everyone to sign up for their absentee ballot. You sign up now. You can request your absentee ballot online from your local clerk. Voting absentee is a great way to go to avoid the lines.
Absolutely. Yeah. And in terms of enforcement, I'd love to get an update on the bills that you introduced around police accountability and some reform there. You've already touched on some examples of how that's shown up just for the cannabis movement here in Michigan. But as we all know, it's a much larger issue that impacts so many communities in our state. So I'd love to hear the work that you're doing around that and where those bills are at in Lansing and how we can support.
Yeah, there's a tremendous amount of work going on in this area, and I'll try to give you the brief version. So my general goal, my pillars of action, so to speak, on this issue are, one, we need better citizen oversight of the police. We need to empower citizens to review incidents and to have some sort of purchase in the disciplinary process. There needs to be greater accountability through citizen oversight. Two, we need to have independent investigations of police misconduct. The idea that in instances of police misconduct that their own department and their local prosecutor can investigate that case, I think is wrong. One, these folks are on the same team, and I think there's a conflict of interest there. Even in maybe a larger department in a bigger area where maybe you really could separate that and make sure that there weren't any personal relationships there, I still think that from a public perception standpoint, the local prosecutor and the local police, they're on the same team. It just doesn't create the right distance and the right sort of message to the public that these investigations are independent. So I've proposed a legislation that would require all of those investigations to be handled by a special unit at the Attorney General's office. Number three, we need to demilitarize the police. We shouldn't be spending any public money on ridiculous equipment, especially when oftentimes that equipment is used to punctuate and cause more violence. I don't know if the listeners have been to peaceful protests before that have been turned violent by the police, but I know I have. The overuse of the riot gear, the SWAT vehicles, the tear gas, the rubber bullets, all of that needs to be reined in a variety of ways, both budgetarily and in terms of the authorization of the use of that force, and in terms of the reporting of the use of that force. And there's legislation on all that. Four, we need to improve the training for our police, and that's embodied in a piece of legislation that I introduced, Senate Bill 945, which has passed the Senate unanimously and is now over in the House on the floor awaiting action, hopefully also at the end of the month. And what that bill would do is two things. One, it would require continuing education credits for police officers. I was pretty shocked actually when I learned a few years ago that we've got continuing education credits that are required for teachers and cosmetologists and a number of other professions, but not for police officers. And so I think that there should be that continuing education. And the other piece of the bill is to explicitly require that police officers are trained in implicit bias, violence de-escalation techniques, and mental health screening, so that they can recognize people in mental health distress, so that they can actually also be exposed to the mental health resources available to officers themselves and destigmatize that, because there's a lot of need all the way around the horn on mental health with respect to police. And so those are four of the sort of pillars. And then the final one, which there isn't legislation introduced on yet, but what I always like to add to the mix is we need to end the war on drugs. If we want to restore right relations between the police and the communities, we have to end the war on drugs. This is at the heart of the toxic relationship, the us versus them mentality, the warrior mentality that sets the police against people, that puts the police in a position of surveilling so many of our citizens, playing this cat and mouse game over drug profits. And it's a disaster. Anyone who's looked into the origins of the war on drugs knows that the war on drugs has not just racist outcomes, but racist intentions and origins. And we need to end it.
100%. Yeah, thank you so much. And so with those bills, where exactly are they at in the legislature?
So amazingly, despite the murder of George Floyd, despite all of the protests, despite the widespread outcry in the wake of that particular instance of police brutality, also in the wake of the Breonna Taylor incident and the Ahmaud Arbery incident, despite all of that, there has not been a single piece of police reform legislation that's been put on the governor's desk yet. The piece of legislation that's closest is that police training bill that I mentioned that's already passed the Senate and is on the floor of the House. I am very hopeful that we'll get that on the governor's desk before the end of the summer. This other legislation, as far as I know, none of it's had a hearing. I've introduced legislation on independent investigations, requiring a duty to intervene. We've got legislation that allows the revocation of a police officer's license in more instances. It's actually very, very narrow, the instances upon which an officer can have their license revoked. All of that legislation is just sort of sitting in committee awaiting action. So that's where it's all at. That police training bill is the farthest along, partially because I'd been working on that before all of these incidents. It's something I had actually started working on back when I was in the House in the wake of the incidents in Ferguson and the Philando Castile incident and the Tamir Rice incident and all, and so fortunately because of that, the training bill had been vetted and been shared around a lot more. A lot of the background work had been done on that.
Okay. Gotcha. Yeah. Thank you so much for giving that update. And yeah, like I said, we will keep everyone up to date on our social media around these bills as well and how they can engage. And yeah, to just kind of pivot a little bit as you're talking about, the war on drugs and its racist origins, and then now kind of moving forward, now that we have an established cannabis industry, a hot topic is social equity and how can we include those communities that have been harmed the most by the war on drugs in this growing industry. So I'd just love to hear your take on social equity in the cannabis space, what you're seeing in Michigan right now, and what you hope to see in the future.
Yeah, well, what I hope to see is an industry that is, reasonably reflective of our population. And what I'm seeing so far is that Michigan is falling into the same hole that every other state has fallen into, which is to create high barriers of entry to the business, make it very, very expensive and difficult to get in. And as a result, not a lot of people of color, not a lot of women are getting into the industry. It seems like we're doing maybe slightly better than some of the other states. And I know that there are a lot of folks who care about this and who are working on it, and I consider myself one of them. So one of the things that we did in Proposal 1 was we did require there to be a social equity plan at the state level, and for that to be published, and for that to be focused on communities disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs, and for there to be an annual report on the demographics. One of the things I'm doing in my office is trying to work with the MRA, the Marijuana Regulatory Agency in Lansing, trying to make those policies as good as they can be. I think that the department is absolutely interested in this issue and is trying to make it right. And they took the direction from the public to produce a plan very seriously, and they produced one. I think it could be improved, but I do think that there's a willing partner there in the State Department. Now, if you read their plan, which I encourage everyone who's interested in this to do, you can see that the state is providing some meaningful support to folks who meet the criteria. My biggest struggle with the program so far, and the biggest thing I'm trying to change, is I'm trying to change the criteria, because I just want to say it as plainly as I can. When we developed that language and when the voters voted for that, I think what we meant was that Black and brown Americans have been disproportionately disadvantaged by the war on drugs, and we need to provide a plan to ensure that there is some level of ownership among those communities, and that that there is a hand extended to those communities to make sure that they have an opportunity to compete in this market. And unfortunately, the way so far the department has been interpreting the word communities, they've been interpreting it as to mean jurisdictions rather than to mean racial demographics. Mm-hmm. And I think that is an unfortunate missing of the mark. I've certainly let them know that. And, I think that's one of the improvements we need to make, because we're not zeroing in on who it is, or we're not zeroing in on the goal that we're trying to accomplish, or at least not the goal that I stated at the beginning of the answer to this question. Mm-hmm. And, so that's one way. But really the biggest filter, the biggest area where I think people who care about this need to lean in and get involved is at the local level. Mm-hmm. Our local governments have an opportunity to shape this in a huge way, for the better or for the worse. And unfortunately, a lot of local governments have taken the attitude where they also want some like heavily capitalized, glitzy presentation kind of operator to come in and win their heart and their approval. We need to be making sure that as community members, we're standing up in these community meetings and saying, well, what about ownership among people who live here? What about ownership by people who are going to make sure that the profits from this operation go back to support our community, so that the employees, are treated better, so that, the owners live here and continue to contribute and support the T-ball team or whatever it is, right? Mm-hmm. The communities have an opportunity to take those kinds of questions very seriously. And some of them are, and some of them aren't. I'm going to highlight one of them, which so far, I think that the community that I can tell is doing the best on this is actually Ypsilanti. The city of Ypsilanti is the one community that said, we're going to have a social equity plan. And in our social equity plan, we are going to reserve licenses for Ypsilantians who meet our criteria for social equity. And we're going to develop a scoring methodology. And we're going to consider this as part of our planning and approval in a very specific and, a detailed way, in a way that has real weight. And so, that's what I think folks need to do is not just focus on sort of what we can be doing at the state level to better support this, because I think there are some things, but also really, really get in touch with those local officials who are the ones who are making the yes or no decisions on the existence of facilities. The other thing we need to do at the state level is we need to fund it. I've got a draft of a social equity bill that would provide funding for applicants who meet the criteria, that provide capital investment. Some states have done that. I think Illinois and California are the ones that I've looked at most. But it's going to be even harder to get those resources given the economic environment that we're in right now. And I was struggling to find those dollars 6 months ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much. There's definitely a lot of work to do. But yeah, I'm so thankful for you leading this conversation and really highlighting those points and representing what people actually voted for in November when they passed legalization and the intent that was behind that. So it's on all of us to hold the state accountable and local municipalities as well. So thank you so much for that summary. And you mentioned a couple times on getting ready for the primary coming up and then the election in November, getting people to submit for their absentee ballot, which I just read today that I think July 20th is the last day that you can request for that without going in person into the clerk's office. So yeah, hop online, get that absentee ballot, register to vote. And then, is there any other tips that you have for people as we're approaching the 2020 election, just how they can engage and remain somewhat optimistic about what we have ahead of us?
Yeah, well, I would just encourage folks to build those relationships I was talking about earlier. And right now we're 1 month away from the primary. We're, just a few months away from the election. Use that time to contact some of these candidates who are running for office. Mm-hmm. There are none of the state Senate seats are up, but every single one of the 110 state House seats are up. What are the candidates who are running for office in your area say about these issues? Mm-hmm. If it's an open seat, in particular, I think that's a great opportunity to pressure those candidates to take a strong position in favor of cannabis law reform. Find some specific questions to ask them to try to kind of push them on this issue, right? Like, for instance, one of the things I'm working on right now is that you can't get a license to be a medical marijuana provider if you've got a criminal record. Now, why is that? Maybe we should get rid of those requirements. Maybe that's another requirement that's holding us back from our social equity requirement or our social equity goals. Maybe that's not the maybe that's not the thing you care about. Maybe you want to reduce the excise tax. Maybe you're upset that your cannabis is too expensive and you want to have like a consumer's kind of approach. I think that's great, right? Maybe you want to ask them a question about testing. Testing is something I'm very interested in, right? I want the testing to be dialed in just right so that it protects people's public health. If that's your passion and you've got a lot of interest and or knowledge in that, you should know that one of the great things about cannabis law reform is that we're on the bleeding edge of this right now. There are a lot of things that are happening in this industry right now. Rules are changing and being amended constantly because we're learning so much all the time and people are learning more every day. We just amended the Michigan medical marijuana rules a few weeks ago. So these rules around testing and around, what is the definition of a plant even, can have a big impact on the industry, and not just on the industry in terms of like the people who work in it or the people who are trying to own and operate it, but also from the consumer side. If we constrain supply at the behest of a few people who want to make even more money off of it, then that's bad for consumers. If we can maximize supply, then that's going to mean better quality and lower prices for consumers. So we're in this amazing time now where we can start to change our advocacy and sort of graduate and evolve our advocacy from just, hey, can we not be thrown in jail and can we not be arrested and have our lives turned upside down because we like to enjoy cannabis in addition to or rather than alcohol, for instance. We can move on from that and start to ask these questions about, well, what about my rights as a consumer? What about the health of these products? What about how some of these regulations are even positive or are sometimes positive or negative, for us and our experience in the market, just as consumers.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That's brilliant. I just really appreciate you taking the time to celebrate with us and to educate our guests on so many important issues. And thank you all so much for tuning in to our first event to kick off the celebration of our 10-year anniversary. And before we hop off, we have a couple more events to let you know of, but just want to again thank you so much, Jeff, for having this conversation, and to just let everyone know who's tuning in, he is so available and, like he said, loves to hear people's feedback. So follow him on Twitter and Instagram, follow our page as well and keep up to date. We will be updating you on all of these issues that Jeff was talking about. For this month, we've got some fun stuff coming up. We have specials for 7/10 coming up at the end of this week. And then our next event, we have yoga happening in West Park. So I'll actually be leading that yoga flow. We can meet here at Ohm and then we'll walk to the park so we can safely socially distance. And then we have a concert live stream happening on Saturday, July 25th, which is a fundraiser for the Last Prisoner Project. So supporting those individuals who are still incarcerated for cannabis crimes, which is absolutely absurd. So tune in and support that organization. And then the last event we have is on July 31st for the comedy show live stream, which is one of our longest running traditions. So thank you all for tuning in, and we will see you at the rest of these events. Make sure to stop by this month and celebrate with us. And again, thank you, Jeff.
Thanks, Lisa.
Have a good one.